Dad, I'm getting married. Just send the money.
The line went dead before Robert Harrison could say a word. The CEO of a billion-dollar empire was reduced to silence by his own daughter's indifference. 28 years old, and Emily still treated him like an ATM machine with a heartbeat. Robert set his phone down on the mahogany desk. The same desk where he'd closed million-dollar deals and earned respect from world leaders. But none of that mattered to the one person whose respect he actually wanted. "Sir." His assistant Sarah knocked softly. "The quarterly reports are ready." Later. Robert walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city. Somewhere out there, his daughter was planning a wedding. The invitation would probably arrive by mail. Official, cold, formal. He pulled out a photo he'd carried for 10 years. Emily at 18, graduation day. The last time she'd smiled at him like she actually loved him. Now she was marrying a man he'd never met. Probably someone she'd chosen specifically because he was nothing like her father. The phone rang again. For a moment, his heart jumped. Maybe Emily was calling back? "Mr. Harrison? This is the wedding planner. We need to discuss the payment schedule for the reception." Of course. Even her wedding planner saw him as nothing more than a checkbook. Robert hung up and made a decision that would change everything. He was going to that wedding. And he wasn't going alone. First, he had to visit someone who'd been watching his family's story unfold for 20 years. Someone at Maria's diner on 5th Street, serving coffee and keeping secrets. Robert visited Maria's diner every day at 3:30 p.m. A commitment he'd never broken in 20 years. It was a small restaurant, but it was special to him. For reasons he couldn't explain. The usual? Maria Rodriguez approached with a smile. "Yes, thank you. One Americano and a slice of apple pie." The same menu for 20 years. Maria was 45 but still beautiful. Life's hardships were etched on her face, but something special lived in her eyes. "You look different today," Maria said, setting down the coffee. "Different? Heavier than usual." Robert smiled bitterly. Someone who'd watched him for 20 years would know. "My daughter is getting married." Maria's hand paused. The cloth she was using to wipe cups stopped moving. "Emily." Robert looked up. It was natural that Maria knew his daughter's name, but something felt different about it. "Yes. She called to inform me." Maria sat across from him without a word. It was a quiet afternoon with few customers. "That girl." Maria started, then stopped. "Yes. Nothing. Just, congratulations." But Maria's expression was far from congratulatory. It was the look of someone who wanted to say something but couldn't. Robert found it strange. In 20 years of coming to this restaurant, Maria had never been so reserved. "Maria, by any chance? More coffee?" She hurried to stand up. But in that moment, Robert saw it. Tears gathering in Maria's eyes. "Would you come to my daughter's wedding with me?" The cloth fell from Maria's hands. For 20 years, Robert had sat in this same spot drinking coffee. Weather talk, news discussions, occasional stories about his daughter. Just ordinary conversations. But this was different. "Mr. Harrison, I'm just a waitress." Maria's voice trembled. Customers at nearby tables began to glance over. "I'd like you to be there." Robert's words carried a weight unlike anything before. As if revealing the real reason he'd been coming to this restaurant for 20 years. Maria gripped her apron tightly. In 45 years of living, she'd never received such a proposal. Especially from a millionaire. I don't belong in a place like that." "It's not about belonging or not belonging." Robert leaned forward. There was an expression in his eyes that Maria had never seen before. Desperation. "Then what is it about? It has to be you, not someone else." Maria's heart raced. She instinctively knew this was an important moment. "Why me?" Robert didn't answer. Instead, he pulled an old photograph from his wallet. Maria's face went white. "How did you get this?" Can I have your answer tomorrow at the same time? Robert put the photo back in his wallet and stood up. Please think about it. After he left, Maria was alone. She picked up the fallen cloth with trembling hands. Only she knew what was in that photograph. Maria didn't sleep that night. Going to a millionaire's wedding as his companion? It was absurd. She stood in front of the mirror. A 45-year-old ordinary waitress. Rough hands, tired face. She'd never fit in at a fancy wedding venue. But Robert's eyes kept haunting her. The desperation. It wasn't a request, it was almost a plea. Maria opened her closet. 2 black dresses. Both for funerals. She laughed. What was she even thinking? Then something fell from her wallet. An old business card. A small piece of paper with worn edges. Robert Harrison, CEO. The business card he'd given her 20 years ago when he first came to the restaurant. On the back, something was written in handwriting. Thank you R.H. Maria stared at those words for a long time. She couldn't remember what the thanks was for, or why she'd kept that card for 20 years. At 2 a.m., her phone rang. Maria didn't answer. But she looked out the window. A car was parked in front of her apartment building. He couldn't sleep either. Maria put on her clothes. Emily was just finishing her wedding dress fitting. Her phone rang. It was Sarah, her father's assistant. Emily, sorry to bother you, but I need to confirm something. Your father says he's bringing a companion to the wedding. Emily stopped walking. A companion? Who? Someone named Maria Rodriguez. I need to know how to arrange the seating. Emily's face went pale. Who is Maria Rodriguez? She appears to be a waitress at Maria's Diner on 5th Street. The call ended. Emily stood there, staring at her phone several times. A waitress? Her father was bringing a waitress to the wedding? Emily immediately called her father. Dad's bringing a waitress? What about our family's reputation? Her voice shook with anger, confusion, and shame. Robert answered calmly. He'd expected this reaction. Emily hung up and looked in the mirror. Her reflection in the wedding dress looked pathetic. Everything was falling apart. Her perfect wedding. Emily clenched her fists. She would never forgive him. Maria descended the stairs into the quiet night, memories flooding back like a dam had burst. A small girl with fever-bright eyes stumbling into the diner on a rainy Thursday. Rain-soaked uniform, trembling hands wrapped around a cup of hot chocolate. The way she'd looked around the restaurant like she was searching for something she'd lost. That was the beginning. The first of hundreds of afternoons when Emily would slip into the diner after school, homework spread across the worn table, while Maria worked around her. The girl never asked for anything directly. She'd order a drink and make it last for hours, occasionally glancing up when Maria passed by, checking to make sure she was still there. Maria had learned to read the signs. Red-rimmed eyes meant extra napkins and gentle words. Wrinkled clothes meant the child had dressed herself in the dark again. When Emily fell asleep over textbooks, Maria would drape her sweater over small shoulders and let her rest. The other customers saw kindness to a regular's daughter. They didn't see how Emily's face would light up spotting Maria through the window. They didn't notice the saved drawings, the way she'd wait by the door on Maria's days off, hoping for just a glimpse of her anchor. But someone had been watching. Someone had seen everything. Meanwhile, David Chase was in a downtown hotel room, arms wrapped around a redhead named Vanessa who had no idea about next week's wedding. His phone buzzed with another text from Emily about seating arrangements and her father's mysterious +1. He deleted it without reading, too focused on the woman beside him. The wedding was approaching faster than anticipated, and he still hadn't figured out how to access Emily's trust fund without actually going through with the marriage. His research revealed that Robert Harrison was more careful with money than expected. The real inheritance wouldn't come until Emily turned 30, and David had no intention of playing devoted husband for 2 years. 8 months of careful work. The staged meeting at the charity gala, the whirlwind romance, the perfectly timed proposal. Emily had been so hungry for love, so desperate to prove she could attract someone who wanted more than her money, that she'd never questioned his sudden appearance. But David had miscalculated. He'd assumed Robert was a typical absent father, too busy to pay attention to his daughter's relationships. What he hadn't expected was for Robert to start asking questions. Or for the CEO to suddenly become interested in wedding details he'd previously ignored. The phone buzzed again. This time, David looked. "Dad's bringing someone to the wedding. Some waitress. I'm so embarrassed." David's blood ran cold. A waitress. Someone who might remember faces, who might have seen him with Vanessa during their public outings. Someone outside the wealthy social circle he'd been so careful to charm. He needed to accelerate his timeline. Back in his penthouse office, Robert Harrison stood at the window, watching city lights blur through unshed tears. The conversation with Emily had gone exactly as expected, but that didn't make it hurt less. He'd failed as a father. When his wife died, he'd thrown himself into work, telling himself he was building Emily's future. But what he'd really been doing was running from the responsibility of raising a daughter who reminded him too much of the woman he'd lost. The irony was crushing. 20 years building an empire to leave to Emily, but he'd forgotten to build a relationship with her. She saw him as a source of money because that's all he'd ever offered. Love had seemed too risky, too likely to end in loss. But Maria had never been afraid of that risk. Robert had noticed it gradually. The way Emily would mention the nice lady at the diner. How his daughter would ask to stop by Maria's restaurant on rare occasions they were out together. The subtle changes in Emily's demeanor after those visits. Calmer, more centered, like she'd found something missing. Maria had done what he couldn't. She'd loved Emily without conditions, without fear, without the paralyzing terror that caring too much would lead to devastating loss. She'd been the mother his daughter needed, while he'd been nothing more than a well-dressed stranger who paid the bills. The photograph in his wallet had been taken on one of his rare visits to check on Emily. He'd arrived at the diner to find his daughter asleep over homework, Maria's sweater draped over her shoulders, the waitress standing guard like a sentinel. The scene had been so tender, so natural, that Robert had snapped the picture before he could stop himself. He'd carried it everywhere for 20 years. A reminder of the parent he'd failed to be and the woman who'd stepped into the void he'd left behind. Now, facing the possibility of losing Emily forever to a man he didn't trust, Robert was finally ready to acknowledge the truth. Maria wasn't just a waitress who'd been kind to his daughter. She was the woman who'd raised Emily when he'd been too afraid to try. Standing in the pre-dawn darkness outside her apartment building, Maria looked up at the windows of the home she'd lived in for 15 years. Small, cramped, nothing like the world she'd be entering if she said yes. But Emily would be there. The little girl who'd grown up in her restaurant, who'd done homework at table 6, who'd fallen asleep to the sound of Maria's voice humming old lullabies while she worked. "I'll do it." 2 days later, Maria stood in the dressing room of the most expensive boutique she'd ever entered, staring at her reflection in a mirror that probably cost more than her monthly rent. The dress was perfect. Elegant navy blue. Simple but sophisticated. Robert had insisted on the shopping trip, had somehow known exactly which stores to visit, which salespeople to trust. But it wasn't just the dress. It was the way Robert had treated her during the entire experience. Not like a charity case or a woman he was trying to impress, but like someone whose opinion mattered. Someone whose comfort was important to him. As she watched him arrange for alterations, for shoes, for the small details that would complete her transformation, Maria began to understand something that had eluded her for 2 decades. Robert Harrison wasn't just a lonely man looking for a companion to his daughter's wedding. He was a father who'd finally found the courage to honor the woman who'd loved his daughter when he couldn't. And maybe, just maybe, he was a man who'd been waiting 20 years to find the courage to love again. Emily's phone buzzed at 11:47 p.m. Unknown number. Check the Ritz-Carlton bar. 3rd floor. Tonight. She stared at the message. David had canceled their dinner again. Bachelor party emergency. But something in his voice had felt wrong. 20 minutes later, Emily sat in her car outside the Ritz-Carlton. The elevator doors opened. David emerged with a stunning redhead, his arm wrapped around her waist. They kissed with the same passion he'd shown Emily just days ago. The anonymous tip made sense. Someone wanted her to see this. Meanwhile, Sarah Thompson sat outside Robert's penthouse, a manila envelope burning in her hands. The private investigator's report had arrived that afternoon. David Chase wasn't who he claimed to be. His real name was Daniel Castellano. 3 previous engagements to heiresses, all mysteriously broken off before the weddings. Each time, he'd walked away with significant settlements. Her phone rang. Robert's voice carried steel beneath the calm. "Do you have the report?" "Yes, sir. All of it." "Bring it up." It's time Emily knew the truth. Wedding morning arrived with deceptive sunshine. Emily hadn't slept. Her wedding dress hung like a ghost in the corner, pristine white silk that now felt like a costume for a play she no longer wanted to perform. David texted at dawn, "Can't wait to marry you today, beautiful." The words felt hollow. Robert stood in his bedroom, adjusting his tie. The investigator's report lay open on his dresser, photos of David with other women, financial records showing his pattern of targeting wealthy families, background checks revealing his real identity. But Robert's thoughts weren't on David. They were on Maria, the woman who'd agreed to face a room full of strangers, to endure Emily's anger, to risk everything for a man who'd taken 20 years to find the courage to honor her. Maria looked at herself in the mirror one last time. The navy dress transformed her from invisible waitress to someone who belonged in Robert's world. But it wasn't the dress that had changed her. It was the decision itself. Today, she would stop being invisible. The church parking lot buzzed with luxury cars and designer dresses. The Harrison wedding was the social event of the season. Robert's car pulled up at exactly 11:30. He stepped out first, then extended his hand to Maria. The transformation was stunning. She looked elegant, confident, like she'd been born to wear designer clothes. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Who was she? Where had Robert Harrison found such a striking companion? Inside the church, Emily made her final preparations. Her mother's wedding veil cascaded down her back. She looked perfect, but perfection felt like a prison. The church doors opened. Emily could hear the organ beginning the processional. She took her father's arm, her eyes scanning the assembled guests. And then she saw her. Sitting in the front row, in the seat traditionally reserved for the mother of the bride, was a woman Emily didn't recognize. Beautiful, elegant, but completely out of place in Emily's carefully curated world. The woman was clearly her father's companion. Emily's eyes met the stranger's, and something passed between them. Recognition? The feeling was unmistakable. The processional music swelled. Emily began her walk down the aisle. But her eyes kept drifting to the woman in the front row. The woman watching her with an expression of such tender pride that it took Emily's breath away. Halfway down the aisle, Emily stopped walking. The music continued, but Emily stood frozen, staring at the woman who was now rising from her seat with tears streaming down her face. And then Emily knew. "Dad," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent church, "why is she sitting in Mom's seat?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, like an accusation, like the beginning of a truth that would change everything. Every head in the church turned toward the front row, toward the woman who had dared to sit where Emily's mother should have been. Toward Maria, who stood with quiet dignity, ready to face whatever came next. The wedding had officially begun, but not in the way anyone had expected. The church fell silent. 300 guests stopped breathing. Maria rose from the front pew, her hands steady. She began speaking, her voice cutting through the silence. Emily's bouquet dropped. White roses scattered across marble. Maria revealed the pneumonia story. 10-year-old Emily, fever-burning, alone in booth 6 while Robert flew to Chicago. Homemade soup, not canned. A sweater draped over small shoulders. A lie told to protect a child from feeling abandoned. Emily's knees buckled. She collapsed onto the aisle runner. Gasps echoed through the church. Phone cameras lifted. Whispers started and stopped. Maria pulled out a photo album. 20 years of evidence. School plays where Robert's chair sat empty but Maria stood in the back row. Birthday parties where classmates didn't show but the diner lady always did. Teenage heartbreaks soothed with hot chocolate after closing time. Emily crawled toward Maria, wedding dress dragging behind her. Sarah Thompson burst through the church doors. Manila envelope clutched against her chest. Her heels clicked against marble as she marched down the aisle. David's face went white. He stepped backward. Sarah ripped open the envelope. Photos spilled out. David with the redhead at the Ritz-Carlton. Bodies intertwined. Hotel room doors closing. Passionate kisses in the lobby. The congregation erupted. Chairs scraped. Voices rose. Someone screamed. Sarah's voice cut through the chaos. Daniel Castellano. Professional con artist. 3 previous wealthy fiancés. 3 mysterious breakups just before weddings. 3 hefty settlement checks. Emily's world splintered. David lunged toward the altar exit. 2 groomsmen blocked his path. He spun around, trapped. Emily struggled to her feet. Mascara streaked down her cheeks. Her veil hung crooked. "This wedding is over." The words rang through the sanctuary. Guests stampeded toward exits. Photographers pushed forward. Chaos consumed everything. Robert appeared beside Emily. He dropped to his knees on the marble floor. His confession poured out. Fear of losing her after losing his wife. Work becoming more important than fatherhood. Maria filling the void he'd created. 20 years of watching from the sidelines while another woman raised his daughter. Emily looked between them. Her father, kneeling in his expensive suit. Maria, standing with tears streaming down her face. Understanding crashed over her. The waitress wasn't just kind. She was family. She'd been family for 20 years while Emily chased her father's attention. Emily stumbled toward Maria. Her arms opened. Emily fell into them. The embrace lasted forever. Mother and daughter, finally acknowledging what they'd always been. Around them, the wedding collapsed completely. Guests fled. David disappeared through a side door. Photographers captured everything. But in the center of the chaos, 3 people found each other. Robert rose and joined the embrace. For the first time in 20 years, the Harrison family was complete. Not because of blood or money or obligation. Because of love that had survived in the shadows, waiting for its moment to step into the light. The church emptied. The flowers wilted. The wedding cake sat untouched. But something real had finally begun. 3 days after the wedding disaster, Robert's car pulled up outside Maria's apartment building. The same building where he'd waited in the darkness just a week ago, but everything had changed. Emily sat in the passenger seat, her hands twisted in her lap. No designer dress this time. Just jeans and a sweater, her face scrubbed clean of makeup. They climbed the narrow stairs together. Robert's footsteps echoed off concrete walls. Emily's breath came in short bursts. Maria opened the door before they knocked. She'd been watching from the window. The 3 of them stood in the doorway, nobody moving. 20 years of distance compressed into a single moment. Emily stepped forward first. Her arms wrapped around Maria, and this time there was no wedding dress between them, no audience, no chaos. Just a daughter finding her way home. Robert watched from the doorway, his throat tight. He'd spent 20 years building walls, and Emily had torn them down in 3 days. They moved inside. Maria's small apartment felt different now. Not cramped, but cozy. Not poor, but honest. Robert sat on the old couch, his expensive suit looking out of place. He began speaking, his voice steady but strained. He told them about the nights he'd sat in his office, staring at Emily's graduation photo. How he'd wanted to call but didn't know what to say. How work had become his refuge because grief felt too dangerous. Emily's fingers dug into the couch cushions. She'd spent 20 years thinking her father didn't care, when really he'd been drowning. Robert continued. He described watching Maria at the diner, seeing the easy way she talked to Emily, the natural affection he'd never learned to show. How jealousy and gratitude had warred in his chest every time he saw them together. Maria's hands trembled in her lap. She'd never known he was watching, never understood the weight of his silence. Then Robert did something he'd never done in Emily's memory. He cried. Not elegant tears, but ugly, desperate sobs that shook his shoulders. 20 years of suppressed grief pouring out in Maria's small living room. Emily moved to the couch beside him. Her hand touched his shoulder, tentative at first, then firm. They sat like that for an hour. No words, just presence. The family they'd never learned to be, finally learning. When Robert's tears stopped, Emily asked the question that had been burning in her chest since the wedding. "Why didn't you tell me about Maria sooner?" Robert's answer came slowly. He'd been afraid Emily would choose Maria over him. Afraid of losing the little connection they had left. Afraid of admitting he'd failed as a father. Emily's response was swift and certain. She didn't have to choose. She could love them both. She should have been allowed to love them both all along. Maria spoke for the first time since they'd arrived. She told them about the night she'd gone home after Emily's visits, how she'd wanted to call Robert, to tell him about his daughter's achievements, her struggles, her growth. But she'd stayed silent, respecting boundaries that had only hurt everyone involved. Emily looked between them. Two people who'd loved her in different ways, who'd kept their distance to protect feelings that didn't need protecting. She made a decision that surprised them all. She asked them to move in together. Not as a romantic arrangement, but as a family. Robert's penthouse had plenty of room. Maria could have her own space. They could learn to be the family they'd always been in secret. Robert's eyes went wide. Maria's breath caught. Emily pressed on. She was 28 years old, and she'd wasted enough time pretending they weren't all connected. David's betrayal had taught her something valuable. Real love didn't come with conditions or timers or financial incentives. Real love just was. Maria's tears started fresh. She'd spent 20 years watching from the sidelines, and now Emily was inviting her onto the field. Robert nodded slowly. His penthouse had been a museum to his success, but it had never been a home. Maybe it was time to change that. Emily stood up, decision made. They would figure out the details later. For now, they had years of lost time to make up for. She walked to Maria's kitchen and started making coffee. Not because anyone asked, but because it felt right. Because families took care of each other in small ways. Robert and Maria watched her move around the kitchen, this young woman who'd grown up in the spaces between their fears. She'd become extraordinary despite their failures, not because of them. But maybe, with time and effort and honesty, they could become the family she deserved. The coffee finished brewing. Emily poured 3 cups, added sugar to Maria's and cream to Robert's, remembering their preferences from 1,000 shared meals. They sat around Maria's small table, drinking coffee and planning a future none of them had dared to imagine. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace. Inside, time moved differently. 3 people who'd loved each other in silence were finally learning to love each other out loud. 6 months later, the Harrison penthouse buzzed with unfamiliar warmth. Maria's plants lined the windows. Family photos covered surfaces that had once displayed only business awards. The smell of home-cooked meals replaced the sterile scent of expensive cleaning products. Emily had moved back in, taking the guest wing she'd abandoned at 18. But this time felt different. This time, she was choosing to be there. The 3 of them had developed routines. Morning coffee together before Robert left for work. Dinner conversations that lasted hours. Weekend trips to farmers markets where Maria taught Emily to pick the ripest fruit. It wasn't perfect. 20 years of distance couldn't be erased in 6 months. But it was real, and it was theirs. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Emily made an announcement that surprised them both. She was starting a foundation. Not a charity for tax benefits or social status, but a real organization focused on supporting single parents and the community members who helped raise their children. People like Maria, who loved without recognition. People like the teachers who stayed late, the neighbors who checked in, the mentors who filled gaps that parents couldn't fill themselves. Robert's business instincts kicked in immediately. He offered funding, connections, resources. Emily shook her head. She wanted to build this herself, slowly and carefully. She wanted to learn what real work felt like, what it meant to create something meaningful rather than just inheriting something valuable. Maria beamed with pride. This was the girl she'd helped raise, the one who'd learned empathy in a diner booth, who understood that love came in many forms. Emily had one more surprise. She asked Maria to be the foundation's first board member. Not as a token representative, but as someone who understood the mission from the inside. Someone who'd lived it for 20 years. Maria's hands shook as she accepted. She'd gone from invisible waitress to foundation board member in less than a year. The transformation felt surreal. But Emily wasn't finished. She turned to Robert with a request that made his breath catch. She wanted him to step back from the day-to-day operations of his company. Not retire completely, but delegate more, be present more. She'd lost too many years with him already. Robert's first instinct was to resist. The company was his life's work, his identity, his legacy. Then he looked at Emily, really looked at her. She was building her own legacy now, one based on connection rather than accumulation. Maybe it was time he learned from her example. He agreed to reduce his hours, to hire a president who could handle daily operations while he focused on strategy and vision. And family. Finally, family. The foundation launched on a Tuesday in spring. The event was small, held in the community center where Emily had volunteered through high school. No society photographers, no champagne, no designer gowns. Just real people doing real work. Maria gave a speech about the invisible army of people who help raise every child. Teachers, coaches, neighbors, mentors, and yes, sometimes waitresses who make sure no kid eats dinner alone. Emily spoke about second chances and chosen families and the courage it takes to love someone else's child as your own. Robert said very little. He didn't need to. His presence there, in a community center instead of a boardroom, said everything. After the event, they drove home together. Three people who'd found each other across 20 years of silence and fear and missed connections. Emily sat in the back seat, watching the city lights blur past the window. She thought about David, wherever he was now, probably targeting some other lonely heiress. She felt sorry for him, in a way. He'd never understand what he'd walked away from. Not her money, but her family. The real kind, messy and complicated and absolutely irreplaceable. Maria dozed in the passenger seat, exhausted but happy. She'd spent decades serving other people's families. Now she finally had one of her own. Robert drove carefully through the quiet streets. His hands were steady on the wheel, his mind clear. For the first time in 20 years, he knew exactly where he was going. Home. To a penthouse that had become more than just an address. To a family that had become more than just a concept. To a life that finally made sense. The foundation grew slowly but surely. Emily hired staff who understood the mission, people who'd been helped by community members themselves. She learned about budgets and grants and the bureaucracy of doing good. Maria split her time between the foundation and a new job managing a chain of community kitchens that served free meals to families in need. She'd never stopped being a caretaker, but now she was recognized for it. Robert discovered that stepping back from his company didn't mean becoming irrelevant. It meant becoming strategic. He made better decisions with more perspective, and his employees respected him more when he wasn't micromanaging every detail. But the best part was the evenings. Dinner conversations that meandered from Emily's foundation work to Maria's kitchen stories to Robert's memories of building his business from nothing. They argued sometimes. Emily thought Robert was too controlling. Maria thought Emily was too impatient. Robert thought they both took too many risks. But they worked through it, because that's what families do. They stay and fight and figure it out together. 1 year after the wedding that never was, Emily received an invitation that made her laugh out loud. Daniel, whatever his name was, had been arrested in Miami for attempting to defraud another wealthy family. The trial was making headlines, with 3 previous victims coming forward to testify. Emily felt nothing but relief. She'd dodged a bullet, but more than that, she'd found something real in the wreckage of her fake relationship. She showed the news article to Robert and Maria over breakfast. They read it in silence, then looked at each other and started laughing. Not because someone else's misfortune was funny, but because they'd all been so afraid of the wrong things. Robert had been afraid of losing Emily's love. Emily had been afraid of never earning her father's respect. Maria had been afraid of overstepping boundaries. None of them had been afraid of the right thing, missing out on the love that was already there, waiting to be acknowledged. They'd almost lost 20 years to fear. They weren't going to lose anymore. That afternoon, they went to the cemetery where Robert's wife was buried. Emily had never been there with her father before. She'd visited alone, leaving flowers and talking to a headstone about the mother she'd barely remembered. This time, they went together. Robert told stories about his wife that Emily had never heard. Maria listened quietly, understanding her place in this complicated family tree. They weren't replacing anyone. They were just finally becoming complete. As the sun set over the cemetery, Emily made a decision. She was ready to start dating again, but this time she knew what to look for. Not someone who wanted her money or her status or her connections. Someone who understood that family comes in many forms, that love is a choice you make every day, and that the best relationships are built on truth rather than pretense. Someone who would fit into the family they'd built together. Robert and Maria exchanged glances. They were thinking the same thing, but neither said it out loud. Emily was going to be just fine. They walked back to the car together, three people who'd learned that it's never too late to start over, never too late to choose love over fear, never too late to become the family you were always meant to be. The Harrison family legacy had been redefined. Not by money or business success, but by the courage to love imperfectly and the wisdom to keep trying. And in a small diner on 5th Street, a new waitress served coffee to lonely customers, not knowing that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply be present when someone needs you. The cycle continued, one act of kindness at a time.